Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, climate bills buried. 3 environmentalists explain what went wrong at the Roundhouse this year and the consequences of continued inaction.
If we do not do something now, we are talking about agricultural collapse. We are talking about skyrocketing food prices.
Plus, gun seizures at schools. An Albuquerque student remains in jail after police say he brought 2 handguns onto school grounds. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Gene Grant. We have new reaction to the decision from prosecutors to drop the involuntary manslaughter charge against Alec Baldwin. Prosecutors say they need more time to review new facts in the Deadly Rust film shooting, and they've also pushed back the next hearing in armorer Hannah Gutierrez-Reed's case as well. At the bottom of the hour, I ask our line opinion panelists if they expect charges to be refiled. In about 25 minutes, we look back on a legislative session with next to no action on climate, despite several measures passed by the Democratic-controlled legislature. Our Land's Laura Pasca sits down with leaders from 3 environmental groups to ask if those ideas fell through the cracks or if there is a more concerted agenda at work. We're also taking a closer look at a new report alleging dozens of instances of abuse and neglect by developmental disability caretakers. In less than 15 minutes, I'll ask our line opinion panel if the state system for investigating those claims stands up. But first, a look at Albuquerque Public Schools, where gun seizures have already passed last year's numbers, with just over a month remaining in this spring semester. Let's get to the line. Welcome to our line opinion panelists for the week. We're happy to be joined in person in our Albuquerque studios by attorney Sophie Martin, one of our regulars. Across the table, that is Dan Boyd. He is Capitol Bureau Chief at the Albuquerque Journal. And back beside Sophie, that is Catherine McGill. She's founder and director of the New Mexico Black Leadership Council, amongst many other things. Thank you all for being here. An Albuquerque high school student remained locked up as of this taping after police say they found him with 2 handguns at a charter school here in Albuquerque. Prosecutors say the weapons are tied to more than a dozen shootings around the city, including a drive-by at Sandia High School. You might remember that. We talked about that at the table here. The 18-year-old student at La Academia de Esperanza is facing a weapons charge and another for receiving stolen property, but he's not charged in any of those shootings. Albuquerque has, as you know, a history of gun violence. And Kath, let me start here. I'm trying to slot this case, make more of it than it might be or less of it. It's kind of hard to figure out, is this an indicator of something about gun violence, about guns in schools? What's the big overall picture here when you think about two students in a high school with guns? What comes to mind?
You know, I think, what we see, the programs that are targeting gun violence, the new DA's, planned intervention in the schools to go and talk to students about guns, tells us that there is a real issue. This is a real concern. I was just recently on a ride-along with some Albuquerque police downtown on St. Patrick's Day, and it was just really a cautionary tale as we're going through parking lots, and there kids who are, teens, 14 and 15, 16, sitting in cars, and, what I'm being told is that we know they all have guns. They are not even old enough to go into the clubs, where at about 1:30 in the morning there will be all kinds of shooting and things like that. And so the availability of those guns and just sort of the street cred that you get if you have a gun, some not even, according to what we hear from APS officials, they weren't intending to do any harm with them at school, but they're bringing them to school. And so we know that there's a problem. There are too many guns on the street, and we have to do something about the number of guns and the easy access to guns on Albuquerque streets and in the state of New Mexico. So the issue is about access to them. Yeah.
Let me, Dan, the details of the story are disturbing, to say the least. The student accused of trying to buy 2 9mm handguns, ouch, from one student, later robbing that student of the handguns with the help of an accomplice while using a rifle of their own. Oh, come on, guys. The student then is accused of bringing the stolen handguns to school 2 days later, as Kathy mentioned, to sell to their classmates. And teacher overheard the conversation and reported them. Thank God for that teacher. Holy smokes. we hear a lot about hardening schools, metal detectors, things like that. Might this have been a case where that might have worked out? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Kathy said, I mean, it'd be nice to look at this as an isolated incident, but I don't think, you know, from what we've seen and the number of other, I think there's at least, 12 guns that have been seized from Albuquerque schools already this school year.
That's right.
You know, I think legislators have tried to address, you know, passing a law that there could be some liability for parents if minors access a firearm, but clearly that's kind of an after-the-fact punishment. I mean, I think to try to prevent guns from getting in schools, I mean, whether that means, metal detectors at the front of schools, I mean, I'm not even sure that would work, but trying to kind of get at the root of this problem, and other bills at the legislature to kind of crack down even more on automatic weapons failed. So, you know, clearly it's not a unanimous support for doing that, but it does seem like this, you know, this trend we're seeing of more guns in schools, and already we've seen, you know, disastrous results, tragic results as a result of that.
Exactly right. Sophie, interestingly, Dan mentioned some legislation, House Bill 9, sorry, which makes it a crime for a firearm to be negligently stored in a way that a minor could access it. All well and good. I don't think that really applies to this case.
This doesn't apply here, right? There's no suggestion that this is actually a parent. These are parents' firearms.
Yep.
You know, I'm reminded of a couple of things. One is, we know that children do not have fully developed brains. They are not, you know, sorry kids, those of you who are watching the show tonight, they're not good at making, necessarily making good decisions. And yet we continue to make firearms accessible to a group that I believe really should not have that access. And so we chip away at the problem here, we chip away at the problem there. I think these laws are important.
Right.
There's no doubt in my mind about that. But I think going back to what Catherine was saying, we have a real access problem here. We have a glut of guns available, not just in New Mexico, but across the country. And this news about these kids in this high school, it has to be viewed in the context of the shootings that we see, both by minors and by adults, targeting folks targeting victims in schools. The hardening that we've seen so far doesn't really seem to have done enough.
Okay.
And I think that, you know, the argument that hardening is, and I'm not suggesting that this was what you were saying, that hardening a school is a solution on its own, is just naive, and just plays into, I think, this idea that more meaningful restrictions can't be put in place. They need to happen. Our country is calling out for this.
It's interesting, and I'm talking about people getting shot at, pulling into the wrong driveways right now. This is getting a little crazy, folks. Exactly right. To Dan's point a little bit ago, it's 14 incidents involving guns on school campuses this year. And APS Superintendent Scott Elder told the Journal last month the district has invested in fencing, locks, camera systems, and is considering weapon detection systems for schools. Your thoughts, Kathy McGill?
So, making those schools a fortress,
Right.
Is that the answer? I have to say that we have to do something. I sit on
let me ask you this, on your question, is it not unreasonable to expect a last check at the door with a metal detector for a 9mm? I mean, we're talking 9mm.
I think that's where we are.
Okay.
How we got there is just unfathomable. Like how we could allow, you know, these kinds of things to happen, and I think the larger question, or the question that we need to ask is, whose job is it to stem this tide?
Yes.
And how many times do we need to say to elected officials at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, do something? And so we keep asking.
Are we at the end of the road on those asks? Have they done everything they possibly can with legislation? And
I don't believe that everything has been done that could possibly be done with legislation.
Yeah.
However, people are still, you know, talking about people's Second Amendment rights to bear arms. So at what point do we need to take a look at that and say, we must do something because, you know, the access is the issue?
Yeah. The polling out there, I'm being very loose with this, but there is some support out there, Dan, for these kind of hardenings. You know, perhaps they're a reaction to what we're seeing around the country, who knows. But there's also the idea that perhaps arming teachers might help with this a little bit. And it just gives me a reaction to table is kind of similar to what my gut on the asking. Do we really want teachers shooting it out with students with 9mm? You see what I mean here? Is that the answer, arming teachers?
I mean, I maybe depending on your perspective on the issue, but I certainly haven't seen that getting much traction in New Mexico, and it does seem like there's a lot of ways that could go very wrong. You know, I think just this issue that Kathy touched on, kind of this culture that kind of glorifies having guns, and and I think the position we're in now, just there are so many guns out there, and then how do you, you know, how do you get that? How do you get them off the black market? I mean, and that's you know, no easy answers to that.
A reminder: during the pandemic, the sales of handguns skyrocketed, and now they're all, as Dan's mentioning, filtering out.
I mean, there are some things historically that we have seen made a difference. I mean, you know, the ban on assault rifles that unfortunately expired. I say unfortunately, like that wasn't intentional, but that did expire. We saw a real increase, a very dramatic increase in guns on the streets following the expiration of that legislation, that law. Buyback programs seem so podunk, but they do serve to pull guns off the street. But those programs can only be effective if we're also limiting the access to guns at the origin.
That's right. That's
at the origin. Can I just say that that you know, 85% of teachers say that, you know, they don't want to carry a gun in school. That's not what they're there for. And then, but you know, why can't we look at what happens in other countries related to gun violence? You know, can we look to see what other countries have done, why they don't have the same kind of mass shootings that we have in the United States?
Sophie, can I bounce back to you for a quick second? Dan, I want you to get in on this too. For years, we heard concerns from the governor, legislators, state's pretrial detention system isn't what it should be, strict enough, but this arrested 18-year-old who was one of the students on campus I mentioned earlier, is being held, doesn't appear to have a criminal record, and is being held after prosecutors filed a pretrial detention motion. Is that proof that the system isn't as lax as critics have claimed, or is this? I
mean, I think it's a sign that the prosecutors were successful in putting together the argument to keep him behind bars. Does that
there
are many moving pieces. Like the law does not work in the absence of action on the part, in this case, of the prosecution. So I think I find it heartening that they were able to, I don't know, heartening is the word that I want, but you know, this looks like a circumstance in which all the correct steps were taken.
Is this the kind of circumstance, Dan, where you've got someone on the hook, an 18-year-old, maybe you make a point here, a big public point about what it is to be of age, but bringing a gun on campus. If there's no consequences here, the public's not gonna be too happy about it. If I was a parent at this high school, I'm looking for consequences here, bringing 2 9mm into a school campus setting.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of political attention on pretrial detention, and obviously there's been cases where judges have released individuals who've gone on to commit other, and even if those are the very small minority of cases, obviously they get a lot of attention, and rightfully so. I mean, I think judges do try to you know, weigh all the evidence in a case, and obviously what prosecutors put in front of them. So sometimes, you know, and they use the Arnold tool and things like that to make these decisions. But I think on a gut level, I mean, sometimes there's kind of a common sense factor. You know, certainly in a case like this, it seems like, you know, for other parents to have someone like that being released pending trial, you know, would be nerve-wracking to say the least.
Unreal. Sophie makes a good point earlier about all of this. It just, we got to get our arms around guns. We just have to get our arms around it in our town. We're suffering. People are suffering from violence. There is ripple effects when someone is a victim of gun violence that lasts for generations. And we have to think about that. So thanks to our line opinion panel on that one. We'll meet right back here in less than a minute to talk about the state's handling of developmental disability providers after a report shows dozens of instances of neglect or abuse. You'll hear about that in just a hot second.
What Governor Lujan Grisham does now, what the legislature does now in the coming year or two will dictate what New Mexico's future is 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That's going to be contingent on groups like ours organizing to counter the power of the oil and gas industry.
Welcome back to our line opinion panel. Now, over the course of 1 month, the New Mexico Department of Health conducted more than 6,800 unannounced in-person wellness visits, for clients receiving services through developmental disabilities waivers. Now, the DD waiver, I'm going to talk about here in a second. Now, the checks flagged about 70 sites for reports of abuse, neglect, exploitation, or other more benign shortcomings. And Dan, you wrote a great article about this last week for the Albuquerque Journal. Can you start by explaining this system for us briefly? What is the DD waiver program and why does it exist at all here in New Mexico? What's going on with this?
Yeah, so the DD waiver program is a program to provide services and assistance to individuals with developmental disabilities, with autism, things like that. I mean, a lot of these folks are, still living at home, but their providers are a parent or another relative. For a long time, the program had a really long waiting list to get in. For years.
How long? I'm curious.
I don't even. I should know that, but it
was notorious.
Okay.
Decades.
I had the feeling.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so there's been a concerted effort, especially given our revenue situation, to really try and get rid of that waiting list. I think, which, good intentions to try to allow more people to participate. I think the pandemic then played a role too. Folks weren't able to go in the field and do their usual kind of checks and things like that. And then, what we saw about a month ago, apparently some pretty bad abuse cases, and we still don't know the exact details of those cases yet, but that prompted the Lujan Grisham administration to say, we're going to do these home visit for everyone involved in the program and make sure they're okay and check out the settings. And so and I think there was a push to get this done quickly. To do that in a month is pretty ambitious. So the story I wrote last week, we heard reports from different individuals that some of the people who were showing up at their houses may not have necessarily had the training or the background in the program. And so to have people showing up at your door and demanding to be let in and to inspect conditions and to talk with the individuals. And
now these are DOH employees?
They're DOH employees, but other agencies as well. They've pulled from other state departments as well. I've heard from a few state workers who were involved in this, and they were just told, here's your list of houses to go to, not given a lot of background, and you're going to work as many hours as it takes to clear this backlog. And obviously, I think some of the issues that then resulted, maybe predictably, but folks showing up.
The question begs about the quality of the visits if you're not, that's not your thing.
Right, and my understanding, even some of these issues that were flagged, certainly there could be some serious abuse cases, but some of the other ones were, a defective fire alarm or things like that. And, even some of the state employees I've heard from, say they didn't know what to look for, what questions to ask, so even if there was abuse going on at a house, would they even know how to identify that?
Sophie, can I sway to you on that? Yeah. Do we know the kind of training these folks had to look for signs like Dan's talking about here?
Somebody knows, but that has not, to my knowledge, been released to the public, and so that's unclear to me. I think too just as struck as Dan was talking about the vulnerability of some of the people who are on the DD waiver program, where something disruptive like a person coming in who they don't know unannounced. I'm talking about the individuals who have developmental disabilities, how very disruptive that can be and may have been in these circumstances. And if the folks coming in don't have training in how to not exacerbate any issues that may already exist, that could have been quite counterproductive. I really understand and appreciate the desire to get this done quickly, but it does feel like it wasn't fully thought through.
Right.
And these reports are really concerning.
It's almost like a numbers game, Kathy, meaning, we did this amount, but how we did it isn't really not the issue, or the quality of the how. But let me go back to something Dan was mentioning with Dan. State Health Secretary Patrick Allen, quote, "There is some training we do put them through before they do these visits. We're pulling people who have a familiarity with the program and possible signs of abuse." Are you buying that? I mean, how much training can one get in a short term to be able to recognize a very complicated thing like abuse? It's not a movie. People don't show up the front door with a black eye and say, I've just been hit.
Right.
You got to have some training in these things.
I want to preface what I say by saying that we need this program.
Yes,
it is very, very beneficial. If anyone has ever, been a caregiver for someone with severe developmental disabilities, you understand this program is needed, the supports are necessary, and I recognize, as Sophie and Dan have said, that we did need to do the inspections. The problem comes with government programs where it's so reactionary. Like, we know that there's an issue now. We got to do these hurry up huddles and go say, let's get a whole bunch of people out there and say, look, we solved it. Not true. We needed to know that the people who are going into the homes have the ability to look at what's happening there and make a critical analysis of what needs to happen, you know, or that this is a home that is, you know, things are being handled well. And to have people showing up at the door who may not be trained is potentially detrimental to both the people in the home and to that staffer who's going out, who is not properly protected, who doesn't understand what they need to be looking for. And if they have given the kind of training that would be necessary, then please tell us what that was so that we can have the confidence to say, to support you, because we understand that this is a program that is very needed. Doing 6,800 site visits in a month, you know, I think, you know, maybe they probably showed them how to use Google Maps or, you know, things like that, how to get to the house. But what did you do beyond that?
You made a point about reporting out. These people reporting out these 6,800 visits, and what do they say? I mean, there's all kinds of things here that just feels, Dan, like it's just, like Kathy mentioned, just a big push. And you spoke with someone who cares for her sister with Down syndrome. She said the state employee who showed up unannounced, threatened her. And what all did she tell you about that interaction? What was that all about?
Yeah, and I've now talked to a few other people who had similar experiences, and these employees showing up and maybe having good intentions, but their instructions were, you know, you will allow us into the house to inspect, and and if not, you know, threatening to call law enforcement, and especially if someone shows up unannounced on your, you know, in the evening at your house, and you don't know for sure who they are and their identity, and I mean, I can understand the reluctance. I mean, this woman I spoke to said she felt like a criminal in her own home, you know, and not knowing, you know, exactly what they're looking for, or you know. I mean, I can certainly see the trauma from that, and I can't remember who mentioned, but just that a lot of these folks do, I think, thrive on routine too, and to have that really upended, you know, and disrupted, I think can be problematic. I even heard that, you know, there may have been some visits by Spanish-speaking homes with state employees who don't speak Spanish, and, you know, so things like that where it's,
I hadn't thought about that.
You know, just that language barrier, and adding kind of to that fear of what's going on and what's happening. So I think, you know, we'll see what happens next now that they've conducted this round of, you know, and there may have been some cases that should have been monitored more closely before, and I would expect we might see criminal charges there, but I think the way these were carried out, you know, it does raise some red flags.
Interesting points there. And Sophie, back to those 70 residential sites I mentioned in the setup. 70 were flagged. Allegations range from possible abuse, of course, to missing batteries and smoke alarms. Drastically different offenses. Should the criteria for flags used by DOH be a little more nuanced to you?
It does feel that way, doesn't it? Yeah. I mean, if it can be resolved with a trip to the hardware store, that's that's different than these more troubling cases. And it may be that internally the Department of Health does have a system for ranking those, but and prioritizing them, but again, not shared with us. And so we really don't.
Thank you for mentioning that. Oh, is it within our rights as taxpayers, whatever, to ask for some kind of reporting out on this? I mean, they stepped into this. It's not CYFD, DOH stepped into this.
Thank you for saying that. They did step into this, and it feels to me like they were unprepared to provide the level of transparency that the community, you know, would ask for. It's, you know, one of the things I was thinking about with the training issue is. We don't know what the training was. We also don't know what qualifications were necessary. So, I mean, it kind of sounds to me like one of the qualifications was that you were already on the state's payroll. Okay, so that's step one. But, you know, what were the other things that were necessary in order to get these people out in the field?
Interesting. Dan, have you heard from others since your story ran?
I have heard. I've heard from a number of other providers, and like I mentioned, from a few state employees who haven't wanted to speak on the record, but who have shared some of their own concerns about how this was done and how the instructions or protocols were kind of shifting as the program went, you know, which is problematic as well. The state did eventually start, when they're reporting the numbers, distinguishing between possible abuse and neglect and then these environmental factors. So they did make that change, but yeah, we still don't know exactly how with the follow up on those, and what's going to be done exactly to, I was told that they were all referred for further investigation, but exactly what that means.
Exactly right. Let's get real here. When people come to the front door, if there's situations like abuse, these kind of people are very good at hiding things, right? That's what they do. And so you have to have a very good radar for that kind of thing. You can't walk in with a training list of things and sort of watch for their reaction to questions. You got to know what's going on here. So I got to wonder if any follow-up coming up down the road on this would be very interesting to read, Dan. Thank you for your work on this with the Albuquerque Journal. It's really eye-opening. Good stuff there. Thanks again to our line opinion panelists. We'll meet back here in a little less than 20 minutes for our final conversation of the week when we react to the decision to drop the involuntary manslaughter charge against Mr. Alec Baldwin. I'll ask our panelists if they think it will ever be refiled.
Doctrine of discovery was just not about claiming lands as one's own and doing with it what one wanted to do, but it was genocide. It was the massacre of whole nations of people. And I want to hear the Vatican address that. I want to hear our archdiocese here in New Mexico address that so that we can properly honor. And really this is what that work is about. It's truth, justice, and healing. And it's about honoring those who never made it home.
2023 was a grim year in the legislature for progress on climate change. Lawmakers passed very few bills, and those that did get through fell under the veto pen of Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. This week, our Land senior producer Laura Paskus got together with leaders of 3 nonprofits for a conversation about what went wrong and why. They also talked about why climate change never seems to rise to the top of the political agenda, even in a state where the public clearly wants politicians to move on climate change.
We are here today to talk about climate change and politics. We've got Julia Bernal, Executive Director of the Pueblo Action Alliance, Camilla Feibelman, with the Director of the Rio Grande chapter of the Sierra Club, and Eric Schlenker-Goodrich, Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center. Welcome.
Thank
Hi.
you.
So it seemed like there was momentum on climate change ahead of the legislative session this year, but it ended up being another really disappointing year for climate action in the New Mexico legislature. In a nutshell, Camilla, what went wrong this year?
Well, it's similar to what's gone wrong the last 3 years in a row that we've tried to bring comprehensive climate legislation. We were presented with a drastically weakened bill by the governor's office at the beginning of the session, asked to support it, and offered some stronger ways forward, but we're told that there wouldn't be a bill if we weren't going to support the one that was there. So we took a different path of trying to push forward 5 different climate tax credits that were to the credit of House and Senate leadership included in the comprehensive tax package, and then were part of a big line item veto in that bill by the governor, and that amounts to 0 action on climate in this legislative session, even though there was good news in many other realms, even in the environment, just not on the climate.
Yeah, so I'm interested in kind of what are some of those behind the scenes conversations that happen leading up to this session? Who's talking, who's making these things happen or not happen?
I think one way to think about it is over the course of the governor's leadership overall in her first term and now into her second term. I think in the first term, she did exercise leadership in terms of promulgating, pioneering methane rules, both through the Oil Conservation Division and the New Mexico Environment Department. She also passed the Energy Transition Act, which is helping in the San Juan Basin, both to retire coal-fired power, but then to also put money on the ground for communities to transition away from their dependency on fossil fuels. I think one of the things that we are thinking about at the Western Environmental Law Center is what is the governor's agenda on climate in her second term, and does she even have one? I think there's a sense that she checked the box on the methane rules, she checked the box on the Energy Transition Act, and she in fact doesn't have an agenda on climate action for her second term. And when I think about what the reason is for that, I think it's the entrenched power of the oil and gas industry and an unwillingness of state political leadership, starting with the governor, to truly challenge that power and to position New Mexico for the future, to really open new doors for a thriving, resilient future that isn't contingent on the volatility of oil and gas revenue, which ultimately is going to go away.
Right, so let's talk about that a little bit, because the fact that we are an energy producing state and we're seeing impacts of climate change. How do we decouple oil and gas from our economy? How do we rectify these two parts of us, Julia?
Well, I thank you, Eric, for what you had to say. I feel like there, in a sense, like I feel like she does have an agenda where it's based on supporting fossil fuels still and utilizing what are called, market-based mechanisms to allow the continuation of fossil fuel industries. So appeasing to that constituency in New Mexico, because of course we all know that New Mexico is very and severely addicted to fossil fuel revenues. But I feel like a lot of what grassroots, frontline, indigenous youth organizations are really looking to is how do we diversify our economy? How can we also stimulate the economy? Is that through like community solar grid projects? Is that by creating economies around remediation and care? I think that there's a lot of thinking behind what a truly equitable, just transition could look like, but it's not going to be a solution that is going to appease oil and gas industry or extractivism in general. Right. So that's, I think the duality of this issue is that we all recognize that New Mexico is in severe need of just transition, but we can't do that while also bolstering the fossil fuel economy.
And if I may, what Julia says also reminds me that, in fact, maybe there is an agenda, and part of that agenda is fossil gas, hydrogen. It's interesting that on Friday, after the session, she vetoed the 5 tax credits, and then on the Monday, the next business day, that she then submitted through her agencies a $1.25 billion hydrogen hub proposal that very much was grounded in fossil gas hydrogen. And the way at least we think about hydrogen, and I suspect Julia echoes this, is that that is a way to perpetuate our dependency on oil and gas, not a way for us to transition away from that dependency, and not a way to truly address climate action in support of frontline communities.
Right. So I feel like, especially after a year like 2022, that was hard on many New Mexicans in climate-related ways. People are sad, people are overwhelmed, they want to do something. And I hear from people a lot who are worried about climate change. And I often say to them, talk to your elected officials. Make sure your elected officials know that you care about climate, energy, water. And yet here we are in a state where we're not like Texas or Florida. Our elected officials understand climate change, understand why it's happening, and yet it seems to me like Democrats will not deliver on climate action. What are the roadblocks? What are the barriers to this? Julia, do you have a sense?
Well, I think that there's and this is speaking from like a young person that hasn't been in this work as long as like Camilla or Eric, and in theory, democracy and democratic process is like, participation and like having the ability to talk to your political leaders and like see the debate out in the legislature. But what we're seeing is that a lot of these debates and topics are really dependent on relationships that people have, whether that's with the governor, whether that's with organizations and their political leaders or legislatures. And that, I feel, is also a deterrent for like forwarding like real climate action and real progress, because there's a lot of political capital that I think a lot of folks are really trying to protect, which, sure, I understand that like having relationships with people is a mechanism to like, see your agenda go through the legislature. But like, let's have the debate. Let's like see how democracy is supposed to work without, getting in the way of personalities or relationships.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Camilla.
Well, I'll just add a little bit. I think after the governor vetoed those 5 tax credits, you saw an outpouring of grassroots community concern onto the opinion pages, full pages of letters to the editor asking why, in a year like last year, where we saw massive fires at one point in every county in the state, generational homes burned, flooding as an after consequence, if we do not do something now, we are talking about agricultural collapse. We are talking about skyrocketing food prices. We are talking about leaving our kids an uninhabitable landscape. And I think that there was a calculation this year in the governor's office that she could cut the budget by cutting progress on climate through the tax package. And I think the clear answer from our grassroots all around the state is that that will not work. When it comes to those relationships, what we are doing is asking our members to reach out in a very personal way to their legislators. You know, we made some good progress in the legislature on banning the transport of high-level nuclear waste here, finally getting a permanent fund for conservation efforts. And I think legislators more than ever are hearing from their constituents saying, you've got to do something hard. You know, we did voting rights, we did gender affirming and abortion care, but when you're standing up against the well-moneyed oil and gas industry, it's going to be that much harder. But there is not a single dollar that comes into this state that can justify a kid's asthma attack, the health care that people have to get because of the impacts not just of climate and on health. And we will work harder than ever, as we always have, a bit of Cassandra, you know, calling on people to address this crisis. But we will keep doing that, and we will do it until we do something different. But it's going to require a transformational approach. We are going to have to leave oil and gas. We are going to have to say goodbye, and I think it's worth recognizing that no matter how well or poorly oil and gas are doing, it doesn't seem to change how well New Mexicans are doing.
Right.
Those jobs are dangerous. People get burned and scarred from doing those jobs, and so does our planet. So we have got to just keep coming back. As disappointing as it might be, as scary as it might be, our kids deserve that we do not quit.
I agree with you, and I don't understand how the potential for sort of planetary destruction doesn't rise to the top of people's political agendas, but it just feels to me like something needs to change, because, you know, I started covering the environment in the Richardson administration, and, you know, we went through 8 years of a Republican governor where bills weren't going to get introduced because she wasn't going to sign them. I feel like what really needs to change and how we're approaching this. Eric.
I think there's a policy answer and there's a non-policy answer. The non-policy answer, I think, is what Julia was talking about in terms of relationships. I think one thing we're all thinking about is how do we build solidarity and power in the progressive sector, and so that it's not viewed as a stovepiped issue, but as an issue that's really about the future of New Mexico overall. This is the moment for us to act. What Governor Lujan Grisham does now, what the legislature does now in the coming year or two, will dictate what New Mexico's future is 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That's going to be contingent on groups like ours organizing to counter the power of the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas industry provides a huge amount of money to politicians. It also provides a huge amount of revenue to the state coffers. And it is also the relationship that most political leaders are used to and comfortable with, listening to the oil and gas industry, not listening to the people. So I think that is something that really needs to change. From a more policy technocratic perspective, it is really transitioning away from our dependency on fossil fuel revenue while concurrently providing support for communities across the state, especially in those oil and gas producing regions, to be able to retrain their workers and move forward. I think thinking back about this session, that's one of the most frustrating things, because there were bills to start building out a geothermal industry in New Mexico that would be very consistent and supported by the conservation community and the climate community to help make that transition, build new industries, and we saw those bills and those tax credits also vetoed. So I think right now what we're seeing is the governor essentially not leading, including at the legislature, and passing up what is otherwise an amazing opportunity to set the stage for New Mexico's future. That's just not happening right now.
Mm-hmm. Julia, you talked about relationships, and kind of, you know, the way I was thinking about it is sort of the backroom deals between lobbyists and lawmakers. I want to talk about the other kinds of relationships that we need to be building to be addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation. What are those types of relationships?
Yeah, so I mean, Pueblo Action Alliance, we're an Indigenous Pueblo organization, and so a lot of our campaign development and programs within our organization are really rooted in our values as Pueblo Indigenous people. A lot of those values are also these relationships that we have with the natural world and with our communities. And, you know, in this bigger global conversation around climate mitigation and adaptation, it has been stated numerous times that Indigenous traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge is going to be a mechanism to, you know, getting to those climate goals. And a lot of what Indigenous groups across the world are trying to do is center that analysis, because ultimately, if you're doing that, you're then starting to look at, you know, you're starting to look at the world differently, not as a resource, but as an entity, as a living entity. That relationship that we have with the natural world is really a part of our analysis as climate activists or climate advocates, whatever we call ourselves. And, you know, I feel like that concept isn't always as intuitive, you know, to non-Indigenous people, and may even seem a bit like nebulous or not grounded in anything that can be action oriented, but ultimately it is, you know. And I think that's been a big challenge in participating in a legislature, because ultimately a lot of the times when we're talking about water, land, resources, we're talking about them as materials rather than not like beings than our relatives. And, you know, ultimately it's just a challenge that we're constantly having to face. But again, I just want to say that it is going to be very vital for the future to center those types of concepts and ideologies.
Right. So you all are with different organizations, have different strategies and campaigns, but I'd like for each of you just to, you know, very briefly, what is the one mistake you think New Mexico cannot make right now?
Doing what we're doing right now, you know, we really need a clear, comprehensive plan. 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we are emitting as a state come from oil and gas and industry. So we need to know that operating oil facilities are complying with the strongest rules. We need to know those are working, and we need to do more if they're not. And ultimately, just we need to keep it in the ground, or we will not create the future we need. But we also have huge emissions.
You get one.
Oh, what about the cars, the buildings,
the fossil fuel, the hydrogen? There's so much to do.
It's so overwhelming. One thing we can't afford to not do right now.
We have a wealth of resources at the table in New Mexico in terms of state revenue. We have to make sure that that state revenue is directed to good things, not to bad things. In other words, don't direct that towards fossil gas, hydrogen, direct that towards communities, direct that to the build out of clean energy infrastructure like geothermal, like wind, like sun, and make use of that opportunity. And I think what's key here is create a sense of belonging amongst the people of New Mexico. Oil and gas industry should not dictate our energy future. The people should dictate our energy future.
Julia, one thing.
Yeah, Eric kind of, that's going to transition to what I was going to say. I'll just add quickly that, you know, New Mexico is really unique in its diversity of traditional land-based people, whether that's Indigenous people, Acequia communities, and those type of community models around land and water stewardship are really going to be important for climate adaptation. And so it would be a huge mistake if those ideas and those models were ignored by the state.
All right, thank you all so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Welcome back to our Line Opinion panel for one last segment. Prosecutors have dropped the charge against actor and producer Alec Baldwin in the deadly shooting of the Rust cinematographer Halyna Hutchins. They dismissed the charge, quote, without prejudice, end quote. Now, film armorer Hannah Gutierrez-Reed is now the lone defendant in the case and faces a fourth-degree felony count of involuntary manslaughter. Now, a pretrial hearing for her has been delayed from mid-May to mid-August. And Sophie, let me start here. What does it mean for a case to be, quote, dismissed without prejudice? What should the public take from that move by prosecutors?
Well, I think there are a couple things to note. The first is that the prosecutor is reserving the right to refile the case. And so they're saying we're not going to move forward right now, but it is possible that circumstances would necessitate filing again in the future, either the same charges or different charges, but they're reserving the right to file on the same charges. And this is pretty typical, I think, in situations where there's an evolving case and they don't quite know what evidence might come forward, be brought forth in the future. So,
and the two folks that are on the case now made that point. We're re-looking at a lot of evidence now.
Yes, and I think that that's an important thing to note is that new evidence is rumored to have come to the fore, and there's some great reporting that helped to sort of explain that to the community. But we're not going to just sort of jump to conclusions. We're going to do the due diligence that's necessary in order to make sure that the charges that we're bringing, and I'm sort of speaking in the voice of the prosecutor, which I don't normally do, but the charges that are brought forward, prosecutors want to make sure that they're ones that they have the likelihood of winning, right? They've got to get through several steps. Now, part of the purpose of dismissing the charges without prejudice at this point, and I guess I'll just say maybe this was implied, but if you do it with prejudice, that means we're done here.
Gotcha.
Without prejudice, part of it is that it stops the clock on New Mexico's speedy trial requirements. And so there's a certain amount of time that can elapse from when you bring charges to when the trial happens. And there's a little flexibility in there, but they're basically saying we're going to stop the clock on this one because we don't want to run up against that limitation. And if you look at me and ask me how many days that is, I will say I forgot that right after law school because I don't work in criminal law.
Dan, interesting. Sophie mentioned about new things that are coming out. The unnamed source told Phaedra Haywood at the Santa Fe New Mexican that the revolver that Mr. Baldwin used, the deadly shot, had been fitted with a new hammer at some point. That's a big deal because until this point, the FBI report on record has stated the gun couldn't have fired by itself. And of course, this is to be determined later in the court case. But that's an interesting little twist there because we've sort of been looking at that gun and how Mr. Baldwin handled it, but not necessarily the weapon itself. What does this say to you with this information?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think that goes to Sophie's point a little bit about this evolving evidence in the case. Right. It does raise some questions in my mind, kind of about the initial investigation too. But clearly, maybe some new evidence has come to light, about this gun and exactly if it could have fired, in it accidentally or not. So I mean, that may well be behind kind of some of this decision. I think politically it kind of raises the question whether the DA might have gotten a little in front of her skis a little bit, with the initial charges. And so that'll be
enhancement that was dropped.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of that. I mean, kind of from a political perspective, but from a legal perspective, I think the special prosecutors, the two that are now on the case, seem to be maybe proceeding a little cautiously with this. While still leaving the door open for what kind of evidence does emerge.
That's a good point there. Carrie Morrison and Jason Lewis, of course, we haven't named them earlier. Thank you for doing that. Special prosecutors. And does this feel more legitimate to you, the case? These people are on board. The tone has changed a lot, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of the prosecutor became the story, and all of the media circus that was involved in it. Now it seems like perhaps they're doing something that's a little more cautious, but the clock doesn't stop on public opinion related to what's happening right now, and it looks like Alec Baldwin is being let off because he is a celebrity, and they just announced that from their perspective that it's over.
That's right.
So that became the story. That the charges were dropped is what they announced to everyone, and that's what people start to see, and then they question that. So I do hope that people will not forget Helena Hudgens, who lost her life.
That's right.
Through no fault of her own, and somebody is responsible.
Let me, on that very point, Kathy McGill, thank you so much. Sophie, let me turn to you. I get this question a lot. We have a person who pled out, or apparently got a plea deal.
Correct.
Can those be turned around? Because I've had people ask me, like, does this guy know something? And why was he allowed do this deal, and can we undo the deal?
Okay, so the majority of cases actually do end up in plea agreements.
Okay.
And so I think that it is short-sighted to look at that and say, well, that's the sign of some sort of smoking gun.
Right.
I mean, it could be something as simple as he didn't have the resources to fully defend himself, felt that he wasn't going to get, I mean, I don't want to in any way impugn the expertise of the public defenders, but they will have been talking with him if that's who he was working with, or I actually don't know whether he's a private counsel or not.
Right.
But there is a calculation that is made in many criminal trials where the person says, like, I can end this now.
Right.
And all that means, or I can go to trial and there are greater risks to me.
Right.
So I do think it's worth keeping in mind that the majority of criminal cases, we do see these offers for plea deals,
Right.
and we often do see that they are taken.
Does it make a difference, again, a layman's question,
Yeah.
does it make a difference that the plea deal was made with the district attorney but not with these special prosecutors? Does that make a difference in the legal world?
I don't believe that it will.
Okay.
I don't believe that it will.
Okay.
That's actually an interesting wrinkle that I haven't thought about before.
Interesting point, because people are speaking, Kathy, in sort of this cryptic language now, like we're backing up a little bit, we're taking a look at some other things. Are we anticipating some major thing to come down here? I'm not sure if, personally, I can see something. Can you see something that these folks can come up with?
I don't see anything. It's been almost 2 years now,
Yeah.
and certainly there have been investigations. I hope those investigations were comprehensive, and they have all the information that they needed to make a decision about prosecution. So I don't see anything new.
Yeah. When you think about it, Dan, we've had the state police investigate, we've had the FBI investigate, the DA's office has investigated, we've had a lot, the sheriff's office, thank you, Santa Fe Sheriff's Office has investigated, everyone has investigated, but we have all these different angles of attack here. There's not a single cohesive line of reasoning here, which is why we go to court, of course, to suss these things out. But what does it say about the case? Is it really that complicated that we just, all these investigators are coming up with different conclusions?
I mean, maybe it is, but I think also when you get that many jurisdictions involved, everybody maybe has their own little take or their own focus of an investigation. It doesn't seem like it should be that complicated, like Kathy mentioned, 2 years almost after the fact. But clearly there's still some unresolved issues there. I mean, I was interested that they're going on with filming the show after all this, not in New Mexico, but in Montana, I believe. So,
like it never happened.
Well, that's worth noting that is an element of the civil case, in which Ms. Hutchins' husband, in order to receive a payout on the civil case, he is now a producer on the show. He is, and I think this is actually, I don't mean this facetiously, I am quite confident that he is a producer who does not have any responsibility for firearms on the set. And it's worth noting that this is also an element of it, is the sort of who has responsibility for what.
That's right. Even as a producer,
even
not necessarily as a person handling
even
the
as
gun.
a producer.
That's
Yeah.
right. Interesting point there. Dan, we bounce Hugh, and I want Kathy to get on this. The media. Is it reasonable at this point to talk about what the responsibility we have to give the entire picture to the public in some way? But this is an evolving case as well. You can only report so much that you have the facts, but in a high-profile, celebrity-driven case, that doesn't happen, does it? It's a circus. It's a media circus. How did we do on this one, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, with the caveat, I haven't covered this case myself, but some of my colleagues have, and I think when you have the international media showing up for, and I think some of the local authorities maybe aren't used to that kind of level of media, very aggressive kind of.
That's right.
So I don't know. I think there have been some things that maybe have been, some headlines that may be a little stronger than the fact, and there's more nuances to the case, especially with the case being, dismissed, but possibly being refiled. I don't know that the media. I think the local media did a good job. I'm not sure whether those nuances were really conveyed in some of the popular press.
I appreciate you saying it that way.
Nicely put.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. Good job there, Dan. Thanks again to the Line panel, as always. Be sure to let us know what you think about any of the topics the Line covered on our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages, and catch up on any episode you might have missed on the PBS app or the Roku or Smart TV. And as always, thanks again for joining us and for staying informed and engaged. We'll see you again next week in Focus.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the viewers like you.